said, and I think that I have an angle on this that might be appealing. And of course, what I was thinking of was the book that Carol and I did. Carol and I had worked together for close to 2 decades on an annual summer teacher workshop in which we would bring teachers in from all over the country to talk about how they could learn about a period in American history that tends to get sometimes overlooked in high school curricula because people get up to World War II, then they're running out of time, they'll skip into the Vietnam War era, and they skip entirely over a very important period, the 1940s, 1950s, after the end of World War II. And Carol and I had also worked together on some other projects relating to Eisenhower. So it struck me, if we could do something, when they said to me, well, could you get the farm as a major element of this story? That was my in. I said, Carol, interested in doing this project? And Carol was ready. And we worked together with the help of a student at Gettysburg College who went through how many hundreds of images at the farm, Carol? Lots, right?
About 3,000 or 4,000.
A lot of images, and he's gone on to great things himself. But the point is, in the end, it was really the ideal project for a collaboration. And you'll get a sense of that, I think, in that we each have special expertise, but our expertise in some ways overlaps. So we could have really good conversations about how do you get a whole life that was as protean as Eisenhower's life into a 120-page book. And that was our challenge. Now, Dwight Eisenhower is a world historical figure, however you cut it. But for our purposes, he's a world historical figure who has an important Gettysburg connection. And that's the thing that makes this really work. And we're going to be talking about specifics of that Gettysburg connection. But when Carol and I decided to do this book, we said we don't just want to do Gettysburg. We want to give people a pretty good overview of the Eisenhower experience. And we have to factor Mamie in a substantial way as part of that experience because they were a devoted couple for more than 50 years. We'll start this story, however, way far away from Gettysburg. It starts in Kansas. Now, I know there are some people in here who will say, wait a minute, he was born in Texas. Yes, he was born in Denison, Texas. His dad had left Kansas because things were not going particularly well for him professionally. In Kansas, he decided to try to start a business in Texas. It didn't quite pan out as he'd hoped, and the family moved back where there were other Eisenhowers already settled in the Abilene area. So Dwight, who's a very small child, is moved back with his family, and more kids arrive right up to, I think, about 1900 when Milton is born. He's the last of the Eisenhower boys. 7 born, 6 lived to adulthood. And the Eisenhower experience really has to start in Abilene. And this is a fascinating piece of American history because, again, if you think back to your own studies of American history, you may have heard about Abilene as kind of a roustabout cow town because it was on the route of the Chisholm Trail where people moved cattle from Texas up into Chicago, obviously, to the meatpacking business. By the time the Eisenhowers are fully settled in Abilene, Abilene is a different kind of town. The roustabout days are pretty much over. It's a residential community. It's quite vibrant. It is still a crossroads, but it's kind of a normal American town, just more rough-hewn because this is still, 1900 and when he's 10 years old and really starting to get out and about from his family home. Dwight Eisenhower was a kid who embraced so many aspects of what we would call a normal Western youth. He learned how to fish. He learned how to hunt. He was someone known who could use his fists when there were things going on in the schoolyard and someone was being picked on. And sometimes when someone picked on him, his older brother Edgar would get into the brawl. Eisenhower was a kid who essentially did all the stuff that you would think any kid who's just excited to be in the world would do. Now, he came from a family that was living on the, quote, wrong side of the tracks. And if you've ever been to Abilene, you'll actually understand that that has more than a figurative meaning because the wealthier folks in Abilene lived along Buckeye Street and its other contiguous streets. The Eisenhowers lived on the, quote, poorer side of the tracks, but they didn't really know, or they didn't act like poverty was a problem. They were an ambitious family, and they were a very religious family. But at the same time, there was always this notion, even though Dwight's father, David, never really made it in the world materially, they had a very strong family value system, which religion was very central to. But they wanted their kids to get an education, and they always emphasized that you're going to strive for something. And every one of those 6 boys who lived to adulthood did make it in a successful way in their own field of interest. Ike was the only one of them who became a military guy, and that's a story in itself. So Eisenhower grows up. He is, as I suggested, rough and tumble, but there's another angle about Dwight Eisenhower that needs to be put into the mix. He was smart, and he was interested in a lot of things. And the 2 things that really stand out about him on the school side of things was that he loved history, and that he read history, particularly about Hannibal and ancient history and the Roman Empire and all of that. But he loved his history. He loved reading about the Civil War as well. But he also was extremely good in math, to the point where his teacher, when he took geometry, basically said, I have nothing to teach you. Here are Euclid's theorems, work them out. And he did that. How many of us could do that? I certainly couldn't. So Dwight Eisenhower has this double angle about him. Now the question becomes, what's going to happen in a family that doesn't have money but has ambition? His older brother, Edgar, decides he's going to go away from home to a very good state university, the University of Michigan. And he's going to go because his brother, Dwight, is going to stay and work at the creamery with his father, and he's going to send the tuition money to Edgar so he can stay in school. Edgar winds up becoming a very successful attorney in Seattle, Washington. The interesting thing here is that in the second year that Ike goes beyond high school, he begins to realize Edgar is not about to come back to Abilene and pay for his education, so he has to start thinking another way to go. He has a friend who lives on the better side of town, a man named Everett Swede Hazlitt, lived in a beautiful Victorian home, and he palled around with Ike. And when they were both about 18, 19 years old, he starts telling Ike, you know, Ike, you can get a free education if you go to a military academy. Now here's the part that you might not know. The military academy they had in mind was the Naval Academy, and that's where Swede went. Eisenhower got himself the appointment from the United States Senator in Kansas. He had everything set up to go to the Naval Academy, and there was a hitch. And the hitch was, by having spent 2 years extra beyond high school working to help get Ed through the University of Michigan, he was too old to get into the Naval Academy because they would not accept a plebe or first-year cadet who was older than 20 years of age, and he had passed that number. The good news for Eisenhower, West Point's entering limit was 21. And so he was able to get the senator to redraw the appointment. He passed all the physical and mental tests, and he goes off in 1911 to West Point. And at West Point, we're going to have Carol tell you a little bit.
Well, I start with this picture simply because we all know this picture. This is Christ Lutheran Church. And in Eisenhower's 4 years here in Gettysburg, his senior class trip is to come to Gettysburg and study the battlefield. Even today, West Point cadets come here and do that. And of course, you can see Ike sitting down there. Somewhere up above there on the left is Omar Bradley. You know, this class, the class of 1915, gets the nickname, the class the stars fell on, because of the 164 graduates, 61 achieved the rank of general. Yes, part of it is the right place at the right time as we get into World War II, but there's also a lot of good stuff going on within this class. He graduates that year, 1915, and his first duty station is Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Now, Fort Sam Houston is very important in his life. That's where he meets Mamie Geneva Dowd. You see, Mamie came from a very, I would say, not wealthy family, but well-to-do family. She was born in Boone, Iowa, spent a little time in Cedar Rapids, and her mother was not doing well in the Iowa climate. And so her father, who was at age 36, able to semi-retire because he was in the meatpacking business and doing quite well, he packed the family up and they moved to Colorado. They ended up in Denver. So that's where Mamie really grew up. Well, at one point, Mamie's the second of 4 girls, and they get rheumatic fever. Now, of course, drugs being what they were at the time, you don't necessarily have a good cure for that. And her older sister, Eleanor, had some real heart problems as a result of this case of rheumatic fever. And the doctor had said the Dowd should go south to warmer weather in the winter, simply because it would be easier for Eleanor. That's what gets them going to San Antonio. They drive down every October, rent a house, and they come back in the spring. Well, one year, Eleanor was so bad they really could not go, and she passed away. But the family tradition continued after that, and the Dowds again returned to San Antonio. That was in the fall of 1915. Now, the people who lived right next door to them, one Sunday, invited them to go out for a drive. And they ended up at Fort Sam Houston because the neighbor's sister, Lulu Harris, was an officer's wife there at Fort Sam Houston. And they stopped to visit. And they were all talking out on the porch. And as they were talking, a door opens right across the street. And out steps the handsomest, sandy blondish hair, erect-bearing, blue-eyed man Mamie said she ever saw. Mrs. Harris calls over to him, Ike, come over here. I want to introduce you to these people. And he says he can't. He's officer of the guard. He's got a walk post. Go check those guardhouses out. So she says, Ike, I didn't say you had to stay. Just come over and be introduced. So with that, he starts heading his way. And then she leans in and she says, we call him the post-woman hater. Now, Ike said he didn't hate women. He said he could not afford women. He gets introduced all around. He's immediately taken by Mamie, and he asks her to walk the post with him. And I think her parents were quite surprised that she said yes. They walk by the barracks. He says, just look straight ahead. You never know what you're going to see by the barracks. She takes it all in. He said he liked that saucy aspect to her personality. For her part, Mamie said he was a bruiser, not like all the lounge lizards always trying to date her. By the time they finished walking the post, Ike asked her to dinner for that evening. Well, she was booked. He asked for the next night. She was also booked. In fact, she was booked for the next 3 weeks. She was 18 years old. It was her debutante year, and she had all these young suitors coming to make her acquaintance. He did not want to be forgotten. When he had a night off from the post, he would go and sit on the front porch of the Dowd residence, get to know her parents, and when these other gentlemen brought Mamie home, he would be there to say goodnight as well. I think he was just totally head over heels, quite frankly. He finally gets his first date, and they're pretty much exclusive after that. So that's the fall of 1915. Valentine's Day, he asks her to marry him. And they get married July 1st, 1916, in her home in Denver, Colorado. Well, Well, they head back to San Antonio for them to set up housekeeping together, and that's when Mamie realizes how tiny his little bachelor quarters are. There is a living room, a smaller bedroom, a couple of tiny closets, and a bathroom. There is no kitchen. And she also discovered how much military gear he had. Now, he had just been promoted. He was now making, as a first lieutenant, $160 a month. She ran the finances for the household, she decided they could afford $5 a month to rent a piano. So they did. And she put it right across the corner, caddy corner. She put all the military gear back behind it. Worked like a charm. Now, they took their meals for a while in the officers' dining room or mess, but it was lousy food, and it was also quite expensive. So after a couple of weeks, they decided to buy a hot plate and cook in. Now, in the Eisenhower household, Ike was the cook, because Mamie had a cook in her household when she grew up. You know, you just don't get that experience if you're not in the kitchen all the time, and she was just not particularly gifted in the kitchen. Her claim to fame was she said she could make fudge and mayonnaise. Her one cooking class she went to that taught you how to make mayonnaise from scratch. So Ike was the cook. Now, they liked to host other officers and wives, and especially the younger officers, the bachelor officers, at their house, their little apartment, for a covered dish dinner. And after the dinner, Mamie would sit at the piano and she would play all the popular songs of the day. She could play by ear, and she was really very good at it. They'd have a sing-along. That would be their evening entertainment. Well, wasn't long, and she realized that she was pregnant. And then the United States entered the Great War in April of 1917. She was due in September. Mrs. Dowd planned to come back to San Antonio a little early that year so she could be with Mamie, and it was a very good thing. You see, on September 20th, Eisenhower got orders to leave San Antonio to go to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, to train new officers. 3 days later, Mamie went into labor. She went to the post hospital in an ambulance pulled by mules. On September 24th, Dwight Eisenhower was born. His nickname was Ikey, but for some reason, and nobody in the family can really tell how this happened, after a little while, they were calling him Icky. I-C-K-Y, Icky. Well, Ike never got to see his son until he got a leave at Christmas time. Then he was back to Fort Oglethorpe, and then he got transferred to, of all places, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to come here to set up the Army's first and only, really, tank training center in the United States, on the fields of Pickett's Charge. Now, Ike thought maybe he could actually get housing for Mamie and Icky to come live with him here, because they'd been separated an awful lot. And he put an ad in the Gettysburg Times. Sure enough, he got a little rental over on North Washington Street, just across from the college gates. Today the building, I think, is painted sort of an olive drab green. And so she took the train ride with the baby, a couple of days worth of travel from San Antonio to get to Gettysburg. And it was, as she said, raining to beat the band when she arrived at the station. Now, Ike was not there. He was able to send somebody to meet her, though, and took her to this little apartment. She said she'd never seen anything quite like it. There was one window in the front and one window in the back. There were doors as well, front and back. And there was this funny little coal stove. She said she never did figure out how that worked. She always had to wait for Ike to come home at night to get it started again. Well, fortunately, just 2 doors down, I guess that's the best way to say, was the ATO house, the Alpha Tau Omega Fraternity House. Now it's the Eisenhower Institute. Well, that building, the college kids, they were all going to go home for the summer. So they offered the Eisenhowers the opportunity to live there, and they jumped at the chance. I mean, it was much larger, had a ballroom in it, had good light, but it did not have a kitchen. So Mamie did her dishes in the bathtub. And of course, eventually, the school students came back, so they had to find a 3rd place to live in town, and that house is on Springs Avenue. So within this short period of time, they lived in 3 different places. So Mamie was busy trying to make a household for her family. At the same time, Ike was busy trying to get his soldiers trained up properly. During the time he was in charge at Camp Colt, in the course of that time from March through November, as many as 10,000 men passed through that camp. And of course, he's to train them in the newest weapon of World War I, the tank. And the biggest challenge is he has no tanks. He has to get creative. He decides to establish a motor school because tanks are mechanized equipment. The engines will break down. You got to know how to fix them. He also knows communications are important on the battlefield. So he sets up training for Morse code and telegraphy. And then to simulate shooting from a moving vehicle at a target on the east side of Big Round Top being the backstop, they drive around on flatbed trucks with machine guns mounted, trying to hit the target while the truck is moving to simulate that aspect of tank warfare. Finally, in June, they get 1 tank. So at least everyone can see it, they can hear it. A few got to drive it. Now, Eisenhower was busy training these men up, infantry tactics, everything that he could think of to get them ready to go overseas. And in fact, they would be taken to the port in New York. His paperwork was always in order. Everybody got on the ship. He did excellent work in that sense. And as soldiers shipped out, more soldiers were brought in. In September, a group of soldiers came in from Camp Devens in Massachusetts. They had just gotten typhoid shots, and they were running fevers. The doctor at the camp said not to worry, but the next day they were all very sick. And that's when the camp doctor here in Gettysburg realized those men had just brought the Spanish influenza to Camp Colt and to Gettysburg, basically. Eisenhower followed the directions of his medical staff. Everybody was isolated. The camp hospital was filled. Tents were set up for isolation. Even the school for St. Francis was used for a hospital during that time. In the course of the run of the influenza here at the camp, as many as 162 men died. Of course, as commander, you're writing home to all of these families. A difficult job for a young man who is 27 years old in his first independent command. And then he gets some news that he's looking for. In October, he gets word that when a certain battalion ships overseas, he can go with them. And they are to be at the port of New York to ship out on the 18th of November, 1918. I know, you know. What happens on the 11th day, the 11th hour, the 11th month? The armistice is signed. Peace in Europe. Eisenhower said he would spend the rest of his military career going to reunions and having to listen to everybody's experience. And he was stuck in Gettysburg. Now, of course, later he realized that his time here was extremely valuable. And he really did get much out of this experience. Well, his next assignment is the Canal Zone, Panama Canal Zone. He and Mamie head down to, I don't want to say that, not his next assignment. Mamie is not even in Gettysburg when the war ends. She had gotten a telegram from her family. Her younger sister, Etta Mae, was extremely sick. They said, come home. And in fact, by the time she got to Chicago on the train, she got another telegram. Her sister had died. She went home, she and Icky, and went to the funeral. And they stayed there because Ike closed up Camp Colt. He was at Camp Dix briefly. Then they went south for a while. They ended up at Camp Meade in Maryland. And that's where the Tank Corps was established after World War I. There was no housing there for wives and children. So Mamie had to stay on in Denver. He gets a chance to get away from Camp Meade for a little while because he volunteers to go on the Transcontinental Motor Convoy. The government decided, now that they'd been through this war experience and they had this new mechanized equipment, they needed to test everything out to see how well certain equipment worked. And they also wanted to test out our road system. So this convoy, and I think there were over 80 vehicles in it when it left the ellipse in Washington, D.C., came up through what is now Business 15, through Emmitsburg, and Ike joined in Frederick, caught up with the convoy. They came into Gettysburg, and they headed west on the Lincoln Highway. Of course, it's Route 30 today, by and large. As they headed out through the Midwest, the Dowds came up to meet the convoy. So they had a little time where they were spending a few days together. But finally, 62 days after they start out, they get to San Francisco. So Eisenhower had a little break from the Camp Meade assignment. And then the Camp Meade folks decide they have to make housing. So they renovate some barracks, and Mamie and Icky are able to come to Camp Meade. That was an exciting time because at this point, Icky's a little older. He's 2.5, 3 years old during the time that he's there, and he's really interacting a lot. And when he turned 3 that September, they decided they were going to get him a little tricycle when Christmas came around. And they had that all purchased, and they put a Christmas tree up. And on Christmas Eve, Icky got sick. The doctor came, said not to worry. But he was worse the next day, and Mamie got sick. Well, the doctor said he had scarlet fever. Ike literally carries him down, lets him see the tricycle as they head on out to the hospital. And he's put in isolation, so all Ike can do is wave at him from a window. In those days, you either got well or you didn't. We did not have the drugs we have today. And on January 2nd, Icky died. Mamie said she never got to hold her baby again. Every year on Icky's birthday, Ike would send Mamie 24 yellow roses. You see, yellow was Icky's favorite color. Well, the next assignment after Camp Meade was the Panama Canal Zone. And when they got there, they literally were living at the edge of the jungle. And Mamie was pregnant again. With the medical facilities and distances to travel and whatnot, they had decided she would go home to Denver to have the baby. And this time, Ike was able to get leave. And he was there on August 3rd, 1922, when John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower, named for Mamie's father, was born. And this is the christening. They packed up when he was about 3 months old and went back to the Canal Zone to join Ike, who'd already headed back that way. I'm going to let Michael pick up from here.
You now know a lot about the interior lives of the Eisenhowers and some of the experiences that they've had. You also probably know a fair amount about the historical Eisenhower, the general, who was so important to the defeat of Nazism in World War II in the Western theater. What most people don't know very much about is that essentially 18 to 20 years in between. These are, in some respects, called the wilderness years for Eisenhower because he was stuck in an army which was much reduced in size. Americans don't like to have a big standing army in between wars. It was a place where promotion was not frequent, and he didn't get promoted very fast or very far. But the 20 years I'm going to briefly talk about now were not wilderness years at all. They were years of learning and opportunity for Dwight Eisenhower to learn different aspects of things that would help him when the big test came in World War II. Carol mentions Panama, and Panama is one of the great examples of this as a learning time for Eisenhower because he had the good fortune to come under the command of a man named Fox Connor. And Fox Connor, who was a taskmaster, took Eisenhower on as his protege. And what we know about the 2 years that he spent with Fox Connor is that he got a graduate education, a serious education, quite honestly, the more serious education than what he had had at West Point. He would ride out most days with Connor on their horse, and he would be essentially having a one-on-one seminar with this very learned general. He was given history to read. He was given Clausewitz, the German military strategist writer, to read. He was given opportunities to read philosophers as well as people who were more involved with military tactics and strategy. And he read Clausewitz 3 times during this period in Panama, which tells you something about Dwight Eisenhower. But most important, he developed his mind and he developed the breadth of his thinking about military matters under Fox Connor. What he didn't have at this point, though, was a route upward in the whole military hierarchy. And Fox Connor, after 2 years, will provide that. He would pull some strings to get Eisenhower named to the cadre of about 250 officers who would go to the Command and Strategy School in Kansas at Fort Leavenworth. This was a kind of further graduate education for Eisenhower. And the slide that you see up here is very interesting because it takes him a while to hit his stride, but he hits his stride to the point where, if you look closely at the slide, you'll see that his rank when he completes his work of 245 members of his class is number 1. So this is a guy who actually is going to be of interest to the higher command and is going to have opportunities. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time walking you through year after year, opportunity after opportunity, but I will mention a couple of things just in passing. Eisenhower gets the chance to go back to Washington to work in the War Department and to work under another very smart general who teaches him about the military bureaucracy and about the interface with Congress. People who said during his presidency that he didn't know much politics misunderstood how he used that time in Washington. He was a very close student of Congress and he had a lot of interaction with Congress. So he does that. He then comes to the attention of a rising star in the military hierarchy, a man named Douglas MacArthur, who names him as, that's going to be a little bit later in the MacArthur connection, but he's going to be MacArthur's right-hand man in Washington, D.C. And it is in Washington, D.C. that he has the single most mortifying experience he would have in the military. And that is, he is at MacArthur's right hand when MacArthur disperses in the most, I would say, nasty way you could, the bonus army that was set up in essentially Anacostia, hoping to get their military bonuses early because of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover took the hit on this because what happened in the breaking down of that encampment, which should never have happened, essentially was put at the foot of Hoover, who hadn't ordered it. MacArthur ordered it. And Eisenhower had to bite his lip and bite his tongue pretty hard, watching what he thought was essentially a very foul deed. That said, he did bite it, and MacArthur liked Eisenhower, and when MacArthur has the opportunity to go and help build the Philippine army based in Manila, he takes Eisenhower with him. This is after an interlude in Europe where Eisenhower is actually given the opportunity to go around all the battlefields of World War I in Europe and write a guidebook about this. And of course, what's better than being on site in a particular location where a military operation occurred that mattered? He gets to see the terrain, he gets to get a sense of just what went down. And he writes that, which shows something else about Eisenhower. The man could write. He writes a military guidebook that you could read today and still find valuable. MacArthur calls on him, though, to go with him to the Philippines, and he spends about 5 years in the Philippines. And depending on your point of view, it was a very good or a very bad time. I think it was both. Mamie wasn't thrilled about being in the Philippines, but she was a good sport about it. John is able to go to school in the Philippines, so he's growing up and doing his thing. Eisenhower sees the good and the bad of Douglas MacArthur. He realizes that MacArthur is a military brain. He also realizes that MacArthur is a prima donna, and Eisenhower has to figure out exactly what he's going to take as a model and what he's going to take as an anti-model from Douglas MacArthur. And you can slice it in different ways. If you read John Eisenhower's wonderful book of essays about his father called General Ike, you'll actually notice that he emphasizes the positive in the relationship with MacArthur. Most historians, including me, would emphasize that he learns how he doesn't want to be in interacting with subordinates and in interacting with political figures. MacArthur was a person who had a very high estimation of himself, and he let everybody know that he was the best man in the room. Eisenhower wasn't that way. So Eisenhower's in the Philippines. If you look at this slide, I hope you notice something about Eisenhower. He shaved his head. It was so hot in the Philippines that he decided that that was convenient. Now, he was losing his hair anyway, I can relate, but he decides that he just wants to get it all off and just be more comfortable. The person he's talking with in this slide, by the way, is Douglas MacArthur's much younger wife, Jean. And you have Mamie seated next to the American consul in the Philippines, who was the former governor of Indiana, and who would want to be president, an interesting guy. And then there's MacArthur on the far end of the image. The years in the Philippines were interesting because Eisenhower plays a lot of golf and learns how to fly. So clearly he had some spare time working in the Philippines. One more thing about the Philippines. Don't know if you know this, but MacArthur actually left the American military to become the proconsul of the Philippine Army at an enormous salary. And he invited Eisenhower to be his deputy in that and also make a very big salary. And the Philippine government at that time, Manuel Quezon was the head of it, they liked Ike and they were perfectly agreeable to that. But Eisenhower didn't want any part of it. He was an American military man, and he would stay with that. And ultimately, he was getting tired of being in the Philippines anyway. He's happy to come back to the U.S. One more thing before we get to World War II. The war actually begins in 1939. The United States is not part of it. We're glad the oceans are large. We think, let the Europeans fight. Let them do what they're doing. But we have to start preparing. Franklin Roosevelt understood the dangers of Nazism. And Franklin Roosevelt starts to rebuild the American military. Eisenhower is tasked at one point in 1941 with organizing the largest single military maneuver that America had ever done in a peacetime, and that was the Louisiana maneuvers. He was the head of the Third Army, which would go into battle with the Second Army. And the upshot of that particular episode is that under his leadership, the Third Army crushes the Second Army, and he comes to the notice of a man by the name of George Catlett Marshall. The picture you just saw was him going over his plans for the Louisiana maneuvers. This is, of course, the man on the right who was the chief of staff of the United States Army, George Marshall, who begins to see that this guy on his left, or your left here, has potential. And so Marshall wants to keep an eye on Eisenhower, wants to use him as best he can. It turns out, of course, that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and Marshall immediately asks Eisenhower, write me a plan for what we're going to do in the Pacific Theater. And according to the story, and it's sort of believable, Eisenhower says, give me an afternoon, I'll write something up, and he does write it up. And Marshall does not praise him for what he does, but he uses the exact plan that Eisenhower had drawn up. It had to do with what we were going to do in terms of Australia, what we were going to do in terms of the next steps in getting off our backs and bringing the fight to the Japanese. So what we have is Eisenhower moving on up, and he's going to continue to move on up right until he gets command of the American forces in North Africa, has to deal with the whole Darlan business, and then ultimately winds up as Supreme Allied Commander. You know this story, so I'm not going to tell this story. You know how Eisenhower rises, and you know some of his headaches and his challenges. Names like Montgomery and Patton, for example, come to mind. But what I'm going to do is turn this over to Carol, because the story you probably don't know much of is how Eisenhower and Mamie had a rough go during this period that he's in Europe and she's back in Washington, D.C. And there's some interesting byplay, even as he is, of course, entirely devoted to her.
Yes, Mamie did have a hard time. You know, they had been living at Fort Myer, and then Eisenhower got assigned to go over to England. And when that happened, Mamie had to leave the house at Fort Myer. And this happened to a lot of other military wives as well. When their spouse was no longer there, they had to fend for themselves. She ended up finding an apartment at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. And there were a lot of other military wives there with her. Now, here is her husband ordering men into battle. They could be killed, they could be maimed. Mamie thought it would be very unseemly to be seen out in public at shows or events, that she just thought she needed to stay in. And that's what she did. And some of the other military wives who were there living in the Wardman Park, they would get together to have mahjong games or canasta, some potluck dinners. Now, she also volunteered. Here she is in her volunteer uniform. She volunteered at the Army, Navy, Marine canteen, which was right down by the train station in Washington. Train would come in, soldiers would get off, they'd go to the canteen. She would wait tables serving coffee and donuts. So they'd move on again, another group of people would come in. And so she did that several times a week throughout the war. Well, on one occasion, while she was there working, all of a sudden she got a terrible attack of vertigo. The entire room was spinning, and all she could do was hang on to not fall. Well, she was able eventually to get home, and she literally was crawling around in the apartment because the vertigo was so bad. The doctor came and told her she had Meniere's disease, which is an inner ear disorder, and it really affects your equilibrium. And if any of you have ever had that experience where the room is spinning, you know how it can be so uncomfortable and difficult. And this disease plagued her throughout the rest of her life. So it was not unusual for her to be walking and have to grab onto something to hold herself upright. But that's when the rumors start. Mrs. Eisenhower is a drunk. Now, Mamie said, nobody drinks less than I do. It was also a difficult time because there were the rumors about Kay Summersby, Ike's driver, that he was having an affair with her. Now, Mamie said, Ike told me all about her. You see, Kay had been engaged to a British officer, and he had been killed in North Africa. Ike said Kay was never quite right after that. He was concerned about her. She was on his inner circle of staff. He was concerned about everybody in that inner nuclear family of a staff. So Mamie knew all about Kay and knew about these issues. And Ike proceeded to send her throughout the war years 323 personal letters. He wrote to her about twice a week throughout the war. Regardless of what was going on, he would find time to send her something. And as she always said at the end, he came home to me after the war. Now, I had the good fortune to know Mickey McKeough and his wife Pearlie. Mickey was Ike's personal tender or assistant during the war. He literally put his clothes out in the morning, he got him out of bed, he put him to bed at night, hung up his uniform, etc. He was with them pretty much 24/7, except when he was at the office. Pearlie was a driver, a British driver, just like Kay was. The two of them said there was never any affair. And if you ever read Kay's first book, called Eisenhower Was My Boss, she doesn't even purport that there is an affair. It isn't until she's ill and dying, and the second book comes out, Past Forgetting, that she says that there's something going on. And quite frankly, I think it paid for her medical bills at that time. But it was very hurtful for Mamie, because by that time, Ike is gone, and there's no way to get anything to refute it. So it was just a very difficult time for her during those war years.
So what do you do when you've hit the pinnacle? He's the man who gets a lot of the credit for the Allied success. He works with a very difficult set of commanders who don't all necessarily like or respect him. Montgomery would be one, but Allen Brooke would be another, and there are still others. What are you going to do with your life when you're 55 years old and you've been to the top? Now, Eisenhower always said he'd be interested in actually being president of a small liberal arts college. And of course, those of us connected to Gettysburg College think about the what if, because guess what? The first honorary degree that he receives when he comes back to the United States is at Gettysburg College in 1946, and he addresses the Gettysburg contingent of graduates, all 85 of them, at the Majestic Theater. Now, in fact, he doesn't become president of a small liberal arts college. He takes time. He's chief of staff replacing Marshall. He has to demobilize the army, not a pleasant job, but one that had to be done. He gets time off to write his memoirs, a best-selling book called Crusade in Europe, which actually is his opportunity to make some money because the book sells so well, and he's able to give the money that he makes in royalties to an investment banker named Clifford Roberts, who tends the money quite effectively for him. But he still has to figure out what he's going to do with his time. Columbia University comes to him and says, would you like to be our president? The university had been kind of in the doldrums because their long time president, Nicholas Murray Butler, had essentially been not working full time for a number of years. And so they needed somebody who could lift a little bit of the spirit at Columbia, raise a good deal of money, and give the university what it wanted, which was, again, a platform to be a great American university. Eisenhower spent, at least technically speaking, close to 5 years as president of Columbia. It was not the happiest 5 years of his life in terms of his connections, because he was never a good fit for an academic institution. Faculty members, you've probably heard the phrase, are the kind of people who a provost or a president would have to essentially herd cats to get anything done, right? They're very independent-minded. Eisenhower never quite fit in with that frame of mind. He did do some good things at Columbia. He started the American Assembly. He connected to a bunch of very rich people who were willing to support the university. And he gave the university the platform it needed on the national stage. But by 1948, he is actually spending more of his intellectual capital dealing with the Cold War, because he'd been invited to go back to Washington at least once a week to meet with the national security folks and plotting how the United States is going to contain the Soviet Union. That's a story, a big picture story that we don't need to spend a lot of time on. By 1950, with the Korean War breaking out on the one side, and with essentially the inability of the European democracies to get their act together in coming up with a way of defending themselves against any potential Soviet aggression in Western Europe, President Truman invites Eisenhower to go back in uniform, to go over to Europe, to knock some heads, to come up with a plan to actually build a credible containment threat. Now, of course, if you know anything about that, basically what you're trying to do is to discourage the Russians from doing anything rash. We did have the nuclear option that we could have used if they attacked, but you still have to have a credible containment alternative. And Eisenhower does his job for about 18 months in Europe, does a really good job. During this period, and Carol will get into the details, but it's during this period that he is now the owner of a home in Gettysburg, which they have purchased in December of 1950, the 189-acre Reading farm, which they found with the help of one of Mamie's closest friends in Washington during the war, a woman named Mary Allen, and her husband, who becomes a very good friend of Eisenhower's, kind of almost like a court jester type friend, George Allen, during the years that Eisenhower is president. That's another interesting side story. I'm going to let Carol tell you about how the house essentially becomes a home. What I'll say here is that Eisenhower is essentially working on two different tracks in the latter part of 51 and early 52, because he's got all this work to do in Europe, but he also has a lot of people coming to Europe begging him to be a candidate for president of the United States. The issue for Eisenhower is very much a front burner issue. Are we going to have a deterrent to potential Soviet aggression, and are we going to maintain democracy in the world as the predominant political economy? And he is not really encouraged by the fact that the leading Republican candidate for president in 1951 is Mr. Republican Robert Taft of Ohio, who is, if not an outright isolationist, certainly a quasi-isolationist. And Eisenhower, according to John Eisenhower, actually goes to Robert Taft and says to him, if you will make a commitment to support NATO, which I firmly believe in, I will not run for president. And according to John Eisenhower's testimony, Taft, who was a forthright man, you have to give him that, says, I can't make that commitment, because Taft did not believe that the Americans ought to be integrally involved in the defense of Western Europe. And certainly we shouldn't be sending troops over there or paying money to support them. So Eisenhower is open to the idea that actually he would stand for president. He was reluctant, but he wasn't overly reluctant. And ultimately, step by step, he gets into the political race. He resigns his commission in the military on April 1, comes back on June 1, and he's all in. And what I'll simply say about that campaign is that he shows himself to be a hard worker, a quick learner, and an effective candidate. And he's running against an eloquent Democrat who was governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, who was very good at the quips and very quick on his feet. But the public was ready for a change after 20 years of Democratic presidents. Eisenhower runs on a platform that's actually a series of little, what would you call them, Carol? Letters, C2, K1, communism, corruption, Korea. And the key thing that pushes him way over the top against Stevenson is on October 27th, 1952, where he gives a speech in Detroit and he announces, I will go to Korea. Now, he doesn't say what he's going to do in Korea, but you can imagine how this translated to the general public. This is the man who did D-Day. If he can do D-Day, he can do Korea. It will get us out in an honorable way. When the election returns came in November of 1952, Eisenhower won a decisive victory and brought in a Republican Congress. And now Carol's going to tell you a little bit about the home in Gettysburg, because that's an important side of the Eisenhower story.
So it was during the Columbia years that the Eisenhowers decided they now could finally begin to think about having a home of their own. Mamie's father had warned her when she was marrying a military man, you're never going to have a home of your own, and for 30 years she didn't, but here she had a chance. George and Mary Allen actually had a farm down the Emmitsburg Road. Just kind of on the left as you're heading south, as you get out beyond the battlefields, was the farm that they owned. And they convinced the Eisenhowers to come with them on a house hunting trip because, of course, the Eisenhowers liked Gettysburg. They enjoyed their time here in 1918, had fond memories of the place. That definitely appealed to them. Also during that time, as he was being very busy helping out in Washington with the Truman administration and still president of Columbia, it was a great location because he could get where he needed to be. And he had the history of the battlefield. Mamie used to say he knew every rock and monument on the park because one of their activities when he was here at Camp Colt was to drive around and see everything. They would do that together, Sunday afternoon maybe. So all of those things helped to bring them back here. Now, obviously, they're busy with other things. They buy the farm, they pay $40,000, they get 600 chickens, a 7-room brick farmhouse, 25 dairy cows, all the farm equipment as is, and then he's off to Europe for NATO. So they have friends running the farm for him, Arthur Nevins and his wife Anne. And then he comes back and he runs for the presidency. Well, they're still not at the farm. They're living in the White House. And Mamie puts her foot down. She said it was time to begin work on the Gettysburg farm. Well, that 7-room brick farmhouse, which you see, it was an engineering study was done for them, and they discovered that 2/3 of the house was log and it had been faced with brick, so it was not a solid brick structure that they had hoped. There was a brick addition added, that's still standing in this picture, and that dated to about 1840, before the Civil War. And the engineers and the architects all said, tear it down, start over. And Mamie said no. They liked the old house. She wanted to save what she could. You know, your 1950s version of preservation isn't quite what we think it is today. You saved what you could in those days, and you built a new house around it, or whatever you could make work out. In fact, some of the logs that are in this picture end up in the ceiling as rafters in the den. You can see the exposed logs. Well, they begin the renovations, and it takes 16 months. You can see here where the logs are torn down, they've started to build the new addition, and this area would be the living room, the foyer, and the dining room of the house today, for those of you who have visited. And then the kitchen is in the old part that they salvaged. And there's more added on the other side, that is the den, etc. On one of the excursions she took, she brought the wives of the cabinet officers to Gettysburg to show off her house as it was coming along. This is the picture window, the opening for the picture window. This was August of '54. But it was still a while until the house was finished. In fact, it wasn't until March of 1955 that the house was fully done and they could move on in. I think it's your turn again.
We'll be brief about the presidency because actually he's living in Washington. But you have a place to go, right, where you can retreat from the pressures of the White House on a weekend, on a holiday, at Christmas. And this is how the Eisenhowers largely intend to use the house. Now, there was one big exception to that rule, and it was a very unexpected thing, and that was out in Denver on vacation in September of '55, Ike suffers a serious heart attack. He does some of his recuperation at the hospital in Denver, and then he winds up moving back to Gettysburg for 7 or so weeks, I think it is, where the home is the temporary White House of the United States. And that's an interesting story in itself. The downtown business community and civic leaders were all in for this, and they offered him space for his office. His office, actually, he had office space in town in what we know is today is the library in Henry Scharf's Gettysburg Hotel, and at Gettysburg College in Gladfelter Hall. It's in Gladfelter Hall, or from Gladfelter Hall, that Eisenhower in December of '55 actually pushes the button to light up the Christmas tree in Washington, D.C. It's in Gladfelter Hall in late spring of 1956 that he makes it clear that he is going to, despite his health issues, the heart attack and then the ileitis attack of late spring 1956, that he will in fact run. It's at Gettysburg that he tells, in Gladfelter Hall, that he tells the Republican leadership in Congress that he's all in. Now, the farm is an interesting place for the Eisenhower to hold events, and I'll just say briefly that they have events for the staff of the White House. They have opportunities for him to work with his cabinet officers in making a budget for the coming year. It's an opportunity for him, of course, to see his family, and that's because they come in for the holidays. So this is a great shot of him coming back from his recuperation in Colorado, being welcomed back by the citizens of Gettysburg. It's just a great picture. And so Gettysburg is going to be home. It's going to be really home when Eisenhower retires from the White House.
Here in Gettysburg was also a great place to host world leaders. Eisenhower decided to make it a diplomatic place as well. And here you can see the first world leader that he brings to Gettysburg. This is Prime Minister Nehru of India, in December of '56. And he and Nehru spent 14 hours in private talks together over the course of the weekend. Nehru stayed actually in the house in the guest rooms up on the second floor, and some of you have seen those, I'm sure. Eisenhower always said that he thought Nehru was a bit of an enigma. And of course, Nehru's trying to be neutral because he's got China on his border and all kinds of other things are going on. And so there were different things, and Eisenhower was trying to see his perspective on different things. Another visitor, you'll recognize here, we have British Field Marshal Montgomery. And of course, you bring two generals together in Gettysburg, and what are they going to do? Tour the battlefield. Little round top here. When he came, he stayed in the guest cottage out at the farm, not in the house. Go ahead. And then, of course, we had Winston Churchill as a guest. Now, at this point, Churchill had a heart attack or a stroke, and he was not as mobile as he had been. Bob Hartley, who was the Eisenhower's herdsman, said that when Eisenhower brought Churchill up to the show barn to see the cattle, and you have to go up a slope to do that, they were in a golf cart. And as Hartley stood at the top looking at them coming up, the golf cart was like this, sideways. The Secret Service said on the way back, they would go back in the Crosley runabout. It was a little more substantial. Eichen Mamie car, yep. And of course, we had Charles de Gaulle as a visitor. And again, he's a military man. They go out on the battlefield as well. But probably the most important visitor of this time period was Nikita Khrushchev. You know, in 1958, November 58, Khrushchev issued the Berlin Ultimatum. He basically was saying to the Allied powers who divided Germany up after World War II, and they divided Berlin as well, that he wanted to get those other powers out of Berlin because Berlin was in the Soviet sector, what is East Germany. It really ratchets up Cold War tension. At this point, both of the Soviet Union and the United States are nuclear powers, and you know, it's just a very concerning effort or issue when this is happening. And 6 months pass, and Eisenhower's attempts to send envoys over to talk to Khrushchev's folks and whatnot have not been successful. But nothing has happened yet. Then Eisenhower learns from one of his envoys that Khrushchev really wants to visit the United States. So he says to the envoy, well, go back, get him to make a concession, and then you can give him a tour or a visit to the United States in return. Well, something must have been miscommunicated, because the envoy comes back to Eisenhower and says, well, Khrushchev is coming to the United States, but he failed to get any kind of concession. What can Eisenhower do? The invitation is issued. He has to make the best of it. Khrushchev arrives. He lands at Andrews Air Force Base in the brand new big Aeroflot airplane. They roll the stairs up to it. The plane is bigger than our stairs will reach. Khrushchev has to kind of crawl out part of the way. Not a very auspicious beginning. You see, he had gone to the Geneva conference in 1955, and he noticed his plane was smaller than the ones that were there for the other leaders. So he now has the new big plane. He gets to the microphones at the end of the red carpet and says, see, we have such great things in the Soviet Union. There's a state dinner. He refuses to wear a tuxedo. He goes in a business suit. His wife does not wear formal dress because he's a man of the people, and he can't be seen photographed that way, quite frankly. Well, they begin their tour, and they spend 10 days in our country touring all over. They end up going to California, to Hollywood. They're in Iowa. Finally, the trip ends at Camp David, just down the road from us. And the goal there is to have a conference with Khrushchev's and Ike's people, and the two of them together, and resolve Berlin, or do something about Berlin. It's not going well. All the advisors that are with Khrushchev are hardliners. They do not want to compromise here. So Eisenhower decides he needs to get Khrushchev away. They get in the helicopter. They come to the farm here in Gettysburg. Eisenhower takes Khrushchev to the cattle barns. Khrushchev is really interested in the cattle operation, by the way, because he had been working in the Ukraine area, and he was familiar with agriculture. Well, Eisenhower offered him a heifer from his herd as well as a gift. Then they head back, and they go onto the porch in the house. And John Eisenhower, Barbara Eisenhower, and the 4 grandchildren are all there to meet the Soviet premier. Well, this is like night and day. Khrushchev becomes an entirely different persona. He becomes very grandfatherly. He literally translates the grandkids' names into Russian, except Susan. Her name doesn't translate, evidently. He not only invites Eisenhower to the Soviet Union, he invites the grandchildren to come too. And he says, you have to wait and come in June. The weather in Moscow is much better. Well, they go back to Camp David. The next day, they are able to reach some kind of agreement. Khrushchev will postpone or rescind the ultimatum per se, but Eisenhower will agree that the 4 powers will meet in Paris the following spring to talk about the Berlin situation. You probably remember what happens May 1st, 1960. The U-2 spy plane with Francis Gary Powers is shot down over the Soviet Union. Eisenhower has to go back to the White House. He's here in Gettysburg at the farmhouse when he gets the word about this. And he has to go back to the White House and go on national television and say, yes, he authorizes the flight, and he even shows pictures of what the U-2 can do. And then they have the Paris summit coming up. All the world leaders arrive. They have a preliminary get-together evening thing. And Khrushchev demands an apology from Eisenhower for the overflight. And Eisenhower says no. He would not apologize. He said, in 1955 in Geneva, I offered you the open skies policy, where we could fly over you and you could fly over our country. There would be no surprises, all important when nuclear war is a possibility. And he had said no. And then Charles de Gaulle chimes in, and I love this. And he turns to Khrushchev and he says, well, what about that Sputnik satellite you just launched? Because he launched another satellite just before this event to make a point, you know. Don't you have cameras in that? You could. Well, of course, Khrushchev said, oh, I would never do that. Well, at that point, everything falls apart, and the whole summit falls apart. Eisenhower always said his biggest disappointment as president is he could not end the Cold War. But at least for a little while, Gettysburg and this farmhouse was able to ease the tensions of the Cold War.
We're now in the home stretch.
They're probably glad.
And we'll be brief. The years from 1961, when Eisenhower comes back to Gettysburg, to 1967, when he departs, not expecting it to be the end of his Gettysburg stay, but to go back and do his wintering in Palm Desert, California, are also not well understood by most historians. And one of the reasons is that the folks who did the marvelous job with the Eisenhower papers stopped on January 20th, 1961. They thought, well, he was just playing a lot of golf, and we don't really need to do that. It turns out that Dwight Eisenhower, in the years remaining to him here in Gettysburg, lived to the max, as much as his health would allow. This was a man who was a good citizen of Gettysburg, who was a responsible friend of Gettysburg College, which provided him with an office where he could write his memoirs. This was a fellow who went and visited many of the local social and service activities in Gettysburg, I should say organizations in Gettysburg, like the Masons and the Rotary and the Lions and so forth. He just wanted to show that he was part of this community. This was a man who came and enjoyed going to the movies at the Majestic Theater and occasionally having dinner with the Scharfs at the Gettysburg Hotel. And there are some amusing stories about that, his driving escapades and Henry Scharf coming out in the street and stopping traffic so that I could try to parallel park. Showing Ike how to use a parking meter and put a dime in a parking meter. That was news to Ike. Some of Ike's aides had to actually teach him how to dial a rotary phone because he'd never done that. My favorite of these stories, and there are many of them, is how he would go into local merchants and he would pick things out. He wanted to be a good citizen by buying from the local merchants, except he never paid for anything. So he'd thank them, he'd take it in the bag, and then he'd walk out. Fortunately, he was accompanied by Colonel Robert Schultz, who was his military aide, who would assure the merchant that if they sent a bill, they would get paid. So the key thing I think I want to emphasize about Ike is just how varied and rich a life he lived in Gettysburg, because you've got the activities that he does that matter to him so much. The rounds of golf that he plays at the Gettysburg Country Club and other area country clubs, the speeches that he gives at commencements to nearby colleges, the fact that he's able to play bridge with his close friends, the fact that he's able to watch Gunsmoke every week with Mamie and do Scrabble games with Mamie, and the fact that the family is so close by, because John Eisenhower, who's helping him with his memoirs, moves his family actually to the corner of the Millerstown Road and Red Rock Road. And so the grandchildren are able to see Eisenhower quite a bit. And both David Eisenhower and Susan Eisenhower have spoken quite extensively about their connections with their grandfather and how important they were. And I won't steal their thunder by giving you those stories. I think what I want to emphasize here is, again, that Eisenhower was working at so many different levels. He is the titular leader of the Republican Party. He is a memoirist. He is a person who is trying his best to be a good citizen of his community, and he's also trying to have some fun. And he does all of those things during the 7 years that he's at Gettysburg, and it's a very meaningful time for him, and of course for Mamie, who finally has her husband on a basically full-time basis. So I would call the Gettysburg years very satisfying. This image is of Ike at Gettysburg College throwing out the first football at the opening of Musselman Stadium at the college in October, I think it was 1963 or 4. 5. Okay, thank you for that. There it is.
Date on it.
And that's the lieutenant governor, Republican Lieutenant Governor Ray Schaefer. To Eisenhower's immediate left is the president of the college, Arnold Hansen, and to the far right on our screen is Hen Brame, who was the longtime coach and then athletic director at Gettysburg College. And you can see it's a happy moment for everybody. Gettysburg did lose to Bucknell that day, but it was a tough-fought game. So what we have is a man who really is a man in full from the beginning to the end. And there he is with the family. And Carol and I will each offer just one or two concluding remarks. And I would simply say that Dwight Eisenhower, as a citizen of Gettysburg, is also a citizen of the world. We owe him so much for his steadfastness. Some would even say his majestic steadiness as president. And yet, and this is the thing, he was a natural man. He was the kind of person who could relate to anybody. He never lost his humility. He never lost his humanity. And this is one of the reasons why we think so highly of Dwight Eisenhower as we think about him in retrospect. And Carol might want to say a word about the farm.
Well, I encourage you all to go visit it if you haven't. You should check because the house is not open every single day. And right now, November coming up, I think it's going to be closed for much of that month as they get ready for Christmas. But they are going to have it decorated for Christmas. That will be, because the reception center is being renovated, there's no heated space to gather groups in to take tours. They're going to have sort of an open house fashion during the December Christmas decorations. And I think it's on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday that they're going to have that running from 11 to 2. So I do encourage you to go out because it really gives you a lovely idea of the lifestyle of the time, not only 50s lifestyle in general, but the kind of life that the Eisenhowers enjoyed here in Gettysburg. And we're just very thrilled that you've been able to join Michael and I tonight for this talk.
Thank you.
If anyone has a question, we'll be happy to give it a go.
I see a gentleman there.
I'd like to ask you, why doesn't Eisenhower have a greater standing as a president? When I went to Abilene to visit his library and museum, I was shocked that most of the museum seems to be dedicated to his military career. He was a two-term president, for God's sake. So, and my understanding also is when he left the presidency, he was asked, how do you want to be addressed? And he said, General Eisenhower. So how did he judge his own presidency, and where do you think he ranks among presidents?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And let me just say here that history has a funny way of, shall we say, changing. Because when Eisenhower left the White House, he was ranked in these presidential polls in the middle of the pack, indeed on the lower end of the pack, along with some lesser presidents. And he had a very, shall we say, self-confident sense of what he'd accomplished as president. He'd kept the peace, he kept the nation prosperous, not bad for 8 years. And he had an average population